Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the first panel of the day. I am delighted to introduce you to this group of companies, different size, different dimensions, different specializations in fintech, different markets. They all are global companies with an interest in the UK, and we're going to ask them about the state of play of the UK financial services and what do they think is the developments in this changing environment, as we know very well, and we've been discussing these days. And I want to start with Sophie Giraud from Fidor. Sophie, these previous days we heard from the Deputy Mayor and from other panelists about how the UK financial services, and London in particular, is going strong and is still at the forefront of what we think is this famous and renowned financial revolution. What do you think? Is that really true? And why?
So to start with, I would say that fintech is global. I mean, like, it's a global movement. We see hubs everywhere, and the idea is not between hubs to compete, but to create value, like, all together. What changes from one location to another is the regulations, because it's the reason why fintech cannot always be global. A company can launch everywhere at the same time, and also market usage. I think London has been uniquely placed since the beginning and will remain uniquely placed in terms of fintech for a few reasons. The first one is, of course, the talents in London. So historically, London is a financial place with a lot of talents coming from banking, as well as a lot of great universities. And these talents have been the catalyst for the development of fintech. There is also an amazing regulator, very advanced, that has been willing to support fintech since early ages. And we can think about, for example, the FCA running the first hackathon ever by a regulator. It's quite impressive. In Europe, I mean, UK people are very digital, and it's also the reason why fintech has been picking up so much. We see that fintech adoption, I think it was a recent study that came up last week, that there is an adoption of 42% of people in the UK have adopted fintech versus, I think, 27% in France. So it just shows that even the people want it. So I think it's the reason why UK is uniquely placed in Europe, and London can actually serve this purpose.
Thank you very much. Couldn't agree more.
Could I add something?
Of course.
Would that be all right? I think the point you made about fintech being global is really important, and we've got to have a duty of care here. If you think about it, California, the biggest state market in the US, its biggest industry, which everyone thinks it's tech, it isn't, it's healthcare. Healthcare creates more percentage of GDP, employs more people than the tech industry. And the health tech sector, which emerged over the last 5 years in California, maintained a very insular view of the world, a lot of incubators, startups, university activity, and big company, small company collaborations. But as happens a lot in America, a lot of inward-looking activity, a failure to collaborate outside the borders of California. And if you look at the way health tech has grown, I mean, it hasn't. It has, but not nearly as meaningfully as one might have thought it would when that market started to emerge. So embracing the position of London as part of a global ecosystem is really important. And sometimes these comparisons about where are we, where do we stack rank, useful, important, not the only issue.
This is great from you, especially because I understand you just opened a new branch. Agreement Express has just opened a new branch in London, so that it resonates with you, and that's why you came over here.
It totally does, yeah. I mean, our headquarters is in not exactly a throbbing epicenter of financial market activity. We're based in Vancouver, Canada, and have been invested in and formed out of Canadian and US investments, and have built a very large global client base, but all from there.
Yeah.
As we've started our pattern of global openings and partnerships, London was a must open for us, and happy to share why in a while.
Excellent. So it sounds like we have the talent, we have the ecosystems, we have a government who's friendly and entrepreneurial. Alexa Fernandez from BBVA, do you think the UK government is doing enough? Do you think policies are, how do the UK government compares with situations like Singapore in terms of supporting this sector?
So I think that the one that is setting the trends in regulatory issues is the UK government. It all started with a mandate from the government to innovate and for the sector to be competitive. And then that was taken up by the regulator with heart. And they've done, I think, an amazing job. As Sophie was saying, they have a lot of initiatives put in place. And if you look at their first, Project Innovate, just trying to help and work with the fintech community, then their regulatory sandbox, and then building the bridges, and then the accelerator from the Bank of England. Every other government is trying to replicate that. So I think the initiatives that they're pursuing and putting in place are being copied. If you look at last year, in April, the regulator announced the sandbox. A year later, we have 16 sandboxes, 8 of them live, the other ones in the pipeline, but that's a trend that the government started here. And so a lot of governments like Singapore are taking it to the next level, but it's important to recognize that it's coming from the regulator and the government here. And if we can continue with that proactiveness and fintech friendliness, then it'll allow for the innovation to continue to happen here in London and spread across the world.
So what else apart from this? Why Jeff Tyson from Capco? Somebody has been said we should look also at Silicon Valley as a challenger, and why is London not there yet? Are there other factors, the culture, nurture or nature? What's it's missing from the system to take it to the next level?
Yeah, someone asked me that question the other day, and I think it's a stupid question if I'm perfectly honest, because you can't compare London to Silicon Valley. Right? Silicon Valley, so the tech scene in Silicon Valley has been up and running for decades. Right? And if you look at, I think London has done an amazing job in the past couple of years, but we shouldn't forget that Tech City was only launched in 2010. So if you look at how far London has come in the past couple of years, I think it's incredible. I think that the big challenge that we have is whether you're a fintech company or another tech company. I think London is amazing if you're an early stage business. You're looking for. We have a thriving angel investment scene, which is great. You can do your Series A, your Series B here, but from speaking to a lot of startups, if you really want to scale your business, quite a few businesses are looking at the US and more towards Asia as well. So I think it's less about culture. Some people say that Silicon Valley is more entrepreneurial, willing to take more risks. I'm seeing that here in London and the rest of the UK as well. So I think it's less about culture. If you look at the fintech sector, though, I think as of last year we had 44,000 people working in fintech in London, which is much bigger than anywhere else in the world. London has been a financial services center for the past 300 years. Right? We've been around for quite some time. So I think it's less about culture, but I think we need to look at ways of scaling UK fintech. And to Sophie's point as well, it is global. The UK is still a fairly small market. So not having access to the European Union, I think it's 500 million people. So those are the types of things that we should be looking at, in my opinion.
Yeah, to add to that point, Jeff's right, Silicon Valley, not necessarily a particularly fair or pertinent comparison. London stack ranks, 7th or 8th in terms of VC investment per capita globally, but the 6 areas ahead of it are all American cities, one of which is the Silicon Valley area. So the bigger question would be what's happening in the US market that causes places outside Silicon Valley to actually have better, bigger capital formation for startup activity than perhaps London, but that's an emerging story. A comment from someone who is I'm from Wales, actually, but I've lived in North America now for almost 20 years, so I'm looking from the outside in. It does interest me how often we talk about the UK and immediately then we hone right into London. And one of the things that Silicon Valley does do well, and is common to the North American startup ecosystem, is that they think in terms of groupings around a hub. It's called Silicon Valley as a reason we don't highlight San Francisco, and in fact San Francisco activity is quite modest relative to the distributed area. Toronto thinks about a broad space that encapsulates Kitchener-Waterloo, which is 100 miles away. I wonder whether the opportunity is being fully leveraged here in the UK to connect the dots outside London. Done a little bit of mentoring in places like Cardiff and Welsh, so that's all I do. Maybe not useful, and I don't get the sense they are as invested in this industry that is so important to the UK economy as perhaps the London gang.
I'm going to dispute that because the regulator has announced that they're building 2 more Innovate and FinTech centers. One in the, I don't remember which 2 cities, but there are 2 cities outside of, I think there's, somebody's going to hopefully tweet the 2 city centers. But one of them, I think, is Manchester.
Swansea?
But they have definitely recognized that there is a whole other world outside of London, and they're making an active effort by opening up these 2 centers. But then one interesting point on the funding. So I think the fact that you have the talent, you have the adoption, all of this makes the UK, London, a great place for innovation. You also have a really dense concentration of financial services. Obviously, the fact that you have banks and other financial institutions that have been here, operating here, and it's historically one of the epicenters of finance, that helps as well. But it's interesting because RegTech, for example, which I would have thought would be the biggest strength of the UK market because of the environment, if you look at the funding levels, it dwarfs in comparison to the number of RegTech companies that have received funding in the US. The UK and Europe leads, but about 2/3 of the funding in RegTech comes from the US.
And is that a lack on the entrepreneurial side or understanding or?
It's hard to say, but it must be, the fact that funding in Europe is historically lower. We still don't have that.
The risk
Everybody
mitigation.
talks about how we still don't have enough funding coming into Europe compared to the US, and now other parts of the world like Asia.
I just, speculative again, I do wonder, in Europe, you're used to the fact that you've got a complex, multi-jurisdictional regulatory environment, and so in some ways maybe you don't see just how extraordinary that opportunity is from an investment perspective. American investors invest into a single regulatory environment that actually is quite simple. And I think they can see exactly how big the opportunity is in RegTech, and they're just being massively aggressive in terms of putting money there.
No, yes, also because there's a number of uncertainty. If you think about PSD2 and the implications of that, that's going to open a number of opportunities, I guess, on the fintech, the whole open banking, as you know better than me, and obviously until that's certain. I wonder if the audience has some questions, or otherwise we can continue. Does anybody have any questions for? I think we can continue. Well, wave at me if at some point, but I guess keeping on looking at all the elements of the ecosystems, what do we think? We mentioned in passing, I think Yusufi was about the market and how the UK market is still strong as well, compared to our fintech situation, in which in the previous days has been discussed as the solution for emerging markets. Do you think that will help and support the growth of the sectors, of the fintech sector, the market demand basically for fintech services?
That for sure, like launching in markets where there is not, like people haven't recognized the need yet, is much more difficult than when people are actually asking for it. I think, like, for example, let's talk about digital banking. The UK market was super ripe for digital banking because there was no digital bank that were launched actually since 2000. There was only First Direct that was actually a telephone/online bank, but nothing had happened, and is the reason why like so many newcomers arrived on the market. So the market was ripe for it. Now, if you go in places where people are not bankarized yet and don't see the use, there is a whole education to do around it. So, of course, the technology can empower them, but it's also an education stuff that needs to be done before actually like offering services.
In terms of the risk factors, we haven't touched upon this, but obviously if we think about UK financial services, there's a big also question mark about how to contain risk. Historically, we know that there's a national system risk element. How do you think the fintech, and this I leave it to you, to whoever wants to chip in, but how do you think the fintech sector can actually help in managing and helping risk compliance in the financial service that has such a pervasive impact across the economy.
Anyone?
I'm sorry.
Bueller? Anyone?
Funny enough, the OCC, so one of the regulators in the US, just published something which is basically an advice towards the banking sector, saying you need to be quite careful when dealing with fintech startups, which I thought was quite interesting as well. I mean, obviously, there's lots of great fintech startups there who are actually helping banks to become, better at managing risk, KYC, compliance, etc. There's some amazing companies out there. Back to your earlier point around what's behind the growth and will we continue to see more and more demand? I think so. I don't think there's a single bank out there at the moment that doesn't run an accelerator program or is partnering with an accelerator or has their own innovation lab or their own corporate VC fund. I think that's only gonna continue. As I was at Money 2020 a couple of weeks ago, we were discussing this exact same topic, so bank fintech partnerships, what's working, what's not working. But personally, I think I'm getting a little bit annoyed when banks see this as a bit of a PR exercise, right? Stop wasting valuable time for these startups, right? And actually make it real. So don't play around with them, right? I think that's going to be quite important. But I think you'll see more and more of these fintech partnerships. Hopefully, we'll see more fintech startups scale as well. Because again, I think that's one of the issues that we have in the UK. The number of large fintech scale-ups, so not startups but scale-ups, is still relatively small, also compared to the US. Part of that is a funding issue. Part of that is a talent issue as well. We did a survey with Tech London Advocates last year where we asked the UK tech community, or London's tech community, what do you consider to be the biggest challenge for London tech? The number one issue wasn't funding, but 87% of people said it's talent, right, or a lack of talent, which is definitely something that we need to address.
Yeah, there's a maturation needed here, again, outsider looking in, around capital formation and availability, around talent maturation, entrepreneurial skills, as well as technology skills. I think it is important to remember that this is a tech industry applied to fin. And what typically happens there is you see an emergence of less of a disrupt the incumbents at all costs attitude, which has typified this and other markets at times, and more of a disrupt through some form of collaboration. So the incumbents can have a huge part to play in driving maturity and risk minimization.
I think it's very hard for big corporations, big established institutions with a lot of bureaucracy to be able to do those kind of partnerships. It takes time, and in many cases we're just not capable because startups or maybe a company that has been in the market for quite some time, their product is still not able to deal with the massive scale of some of these institutions. And so I think part of the role that we as banks and as incumbents have to play is in supporting that community. It's not just about whether or not we can fund you, whether or not we can do an actual partnership or a POC with you. It's about giving you support to help you get to that next level. There's only so much we can do with only so many companies. And so part of what I see as my responsibility as somebody working at a bank is, as cliche as it sounds, it's about mentoring and giving advice and supporting in ways that are perhaps outside of the traditional, let's do something on a contract. And you see that a lot. It's individuals that are also helping to make that difference, but it's also incumbent for us to do that because the innovation and the change is going to come from that community, and so we want to nurture it. And individuals can help that in the way that perhaps the bigger institutions cannot because of so much legacy and bureaucracy that we have to deal with.
It's interesting because then in some ways sometimes fintechs feel so special, but somehow this issue about innovation coming from smaller realities and having a bearing on larger companies is common to a number of industry sectors. We see this in energy, we see this in telecoms, and I guess fintech is just challenging because you have different sectors coming together and different expertise and different skills. So it's interesting to note how there's a role for every stakeholder, not government and startups, but also larger companies.
I think the interesting thing will be as smaller fintechs begin to work out how to partner with each other more in order to create real value that's greater than some of the parts. And I think some of the larger solution integrators and developers have a part to play in helping guide those small companies on how to work together to create value. You see a little more of that happening in ecosystems in North America. It's not absent here, but I see it a little more individualistically as we've engaged the smaller players and data providers here.
I guess, forgive me if I bring it back to my side, but I guess there's a big role on education then, not only on the technical skills or the financial technical skills, but actually on how you do collaboration and how understanding how this innovation in these areas begins.
I would just add that there is this big role of education, but there is also this big responsibility for large basically organization to actually also support the companies in not trying to change their mission, because sometimes we have seen that in several accelerators where large organizations arrive and have something in mind that they would like the startup to do, and they advise them to actually pivot, but it actually only applies to this large organization. So I think it's also about the responsibility of those organizations to take a bit distance and not focus only on what applies to them, but what is good for the startup, the industry, and what can apply to several of them.
Can we give some case studies, some examples of accelerators that actually respect this and that are successful in this?
I'll talk about some acquisitions that we've done. So we've acquired 2 digital banks, Simple in the US and Holvi out of Finland. And that acquisition has not meant complete integration. So we try and keep them, as you said, quite separate from the bigger organization to allow them to work independently as if they were not part of the bank. Because we do recognize that by bringing in our established procedures and mindset, there's a risk. And so that's an example of where we try to keep hands off, help where we can, because we do also have some expertise and knowledge to share, but we also want them to continue to innovate.
Yes, a question over there. If you can tell your name, your flesh.
Hi, Andrew Fletcher from Thomson Reuters. I was just curious on this question of partnership, if you could call out some banks that you think do this well. Obviously, apart from BBVA, we can take them as given.
Just
Well, I will start with our new shareholder because I think they are doing very well. So I'm from Fidor, and we got acquired by BPCE, which is one of the largest banks in Europe. It's the second one in France, and basically, like, so far, integration is going well because basically what Alexa says, like they are not trying to absorb us. It's about for Fidor to keep on with their mission, really. So
we've got a couple of Canadian examples just to keep it close to where our HQ is. The most visible program for innovation and partnering with fintech startups in Canada is Scotiabank, who have something called the Digital Factory, gets a lot of visibility. In fact, not that great a program, very difficult to deal with, not that practical or operationally entwined. Royal Bank, which is the biggest bank in Canada, has a much more low-key program, but the innovation group are operationally empowered both to deny access, which is important, but also to help fintech businesses shape together means of access that can lead to material engagement that helps both the fintech and the bank. We found them to be very smart in thinking just as much about the smaller company as well as about the bank itself and where there could be value. It's not very helpful for London, but there's an example.
No, I think that's a very, very important point, and quite often where it goes wrong as well. As I said earlier, there shouldn't be a PR exercise. You need to be very clear as to why you want to do this. Why do you want to partner with Startup Bootcamp, a Techstars, a Rocketspace, etc., etc. I think if you look at Barclays partnering with Techstars, Lloyds partnering with Startup Bootcamp, we've seen some very good examples in the UK as well, but a lot of it comes down to the people who are running this. Yeah, and to your point, to what extent do they have the freedom and the responsibility to actually make this a success? Or do they still have to go through 26 layers of governance within the organization to then find the right person who can work with that startup and who's going to act as the business sponsor?
Sure. we had another question over there? Sorry.
Hi, Prue Ashby, London and Partners. We help companies from overseas set up in London, and we help high-growth companies grow. I just want to pick up on one earlier point that Ian made. You said that the US is a unified regulatory environment. Speaking to fintech companies I've worked with over there, they say there's 50 states and 50 different regulatory environments that they have to go through, so it's not maybe as straightforward as...
I was being somewhat hyperbolic, but it's pretty modest bars at the state level. The federal stuff is pretty ubiquitous, so yeah.
But my question is, as I work for the Mayor of London and we're here to support companies, as I say, what would the panelists like us to be doing more of to support the growth of companies using London as a base to globalise themselves?
Speaking as the North American company at the table, we hear a lot and heard a lot as we made our decision about where to locate this amongst some other offices. We hear a lot about the regulatory environment. We hear a lot about the government environment. We hear a lot about the existence of the financial services market. The talent pool for both technology and finance is sold way less hard and in way less detail to certainly overseas companies coming in than the reg environment, the political environment, and the existing financial services businesses. And I think for us anyway, the talent pool combination was key. In the US, New York seems logical for the East Coast, but in fact we opened in Boston because the finance expertise might live in New York, but you get way better commercial experience for a software company in Boston, and it's easy to do business between the two. But London's a no-brainer from a talent perspective in terms of a European hub. It's a perfect combination. Didn't get sold that hard to us. And again, I'm being hyperbolic. Nobody was selling to us. You know what I mean. I've got a
long Christmas wish list for you, Prue. So let's grab a coffee afterwards.
Excellent.
I think there's a lot happening here, and it's very important to understand how all of that can be harnessed and exported. So if you look at, for example, a bank like ourselves, there are tons of financial institutions who have a presence here, but you're not headquartered here. Your primary business is not here. So how do you take what is happening here and carry that across the globe? So I'll give you an example. I met 2 entrepreneurs from Chile that were here because they wanted to launch a cross-border FX business. They weren't quite sure, but they were thinking maybe a TransferWise for Latin America or a digital bank in Latin America. And they thought it would be much easier for them to do it from London because of the favorable regulatory environment and the ecosystem than in trying to do it in Chile. So that's amazing. If you can bring entrepreneurs like that to really take advantage of what's happening here, to do other really interesting and exciting stuff across the world. That would be my request.
Yeah, that's a big point, actually. So much is talked about in terms of the UK and Europe, and I understand there's some issue about to happen that might be a problem. But we don't talk so much. I'm Welsh, we voted for it, right? So, we don't talk so much about the impact that the London market, the UK market still has on the Middle East banking environment, the North African banking environment, the Asian banking environment through dual head offices and influence. It's huge. So there's all of these facets that go way beyond European influence and make London just key for an external company coming in.
If I had to pick one or maybe 2 things, Prue, number one, more inward investment. Right? So we're seeing lots and lots of interest from Asian investors, from other investors from the US as well. Some of them have now set up a business here in London, which is great. So personally, I'd like to see more of that. Then back to the earlier point around scaling up businesses, I think that funding is absolutely necessary. And then to Ian's point, it would be great to have more, and I'm not sure to what extent London Partners can play a role there, but more successful entrepreneurs who invest back into new promising businesses and help them to scale as well.
And on the Christmas wishes note, please join me thanking our panelists for an interesting conversation. Thank you so much. Enjoy the day.